Long before the stars dimmed and silence claimed dying empires, a world no one noticed became the fulcrum of change. They called it Guyana chaotic, fractured, overlooked, until the Velari arrived. And when the Draxan came to crush the Terrans, did what no other species had dared. This is the story of how obscurity became legend, except the Terrans. When our coalition's exploration drones found the Helion expanse, we knew just from initial scans that there was nothing much of note there. Most of the planets there were completely devoid of life of any kind, just a handful of barren rocks and Zephyros cores. The only planet that was interesting was the third planet, which scans showed to be filled with life. Over the next several days, our probes scouted the Guyana. While it could not see much through the immense amount of space debris that littered the planet, apparently from failed launches into space, it got some intel on what was on the surface. There was a diversity of flora and fauna, an abundance of liquid water that shockingly was littered with specks of stagnant islands of debris, and a sapient species known as Terrans that seemed to be the cause of the somewhat common structures and the aforementioned space debris. Scans showed there to be just about 8 billion members of this race. The probe continued onwards after a couple weeks of scanning the surface. Its primary mission was to explore a newly discovered system that seemed to be rich in resources, and it wouldn't stop for some out-of-the-way planet on the edge of nowhere. Sure, the Terrans had realized that they could go to space, but by the amount of debris hovering around their planet, all of their attempts had basically failed. It seemed to most scientists that the Terrans would need another 2,000 cycles before they made ships capable of leaving the Guyana, and even more to discover QSX travel on their own. We had never seen such a pitifully slow race before. Most species that tried to get to space would immediately make it their main goal to break the confines of their home planet. Except, well, the Terrans. Sometime later, a conflict broke between two member races of the coalition, the powerful warlike Draxan, and the somewhat newer and much more docile Velari. Everyone knew the Velari were the victims in this war, but knew that they would face the wrath of the Draxan's powerful military if they interceded. So the Draxan ships easily glanced and sterilized one world, captured their other planet without so much as a sweat, and used their influence in the Senate to convince their allies and some swing races to kick the Velari out of the coalition. Nobody tried to defend the Velari. They were a fledgling member race with no representatives in the government, with few outstanding qualities to speak of. Only 10 billion members and nearly non-existent military, which may have been part of the reason why the Draxan invaded, and only a handful of QSX-capable ships. They were almost as pitiful as the Terrans, as one senator noted, and it might be best to send them to the Sol system and test the Terrans. It would be a waste of resources, after all, to send an actually important race and a new fleet to greet the Terrans. Why not use the Velari? So the 52 large Velari colony ships and numerous smaller civilian freighters and transports, all carrying their share of the 7 billion who survived the war and weren't enslaved by the Draxan, jumped on their own to the Sol system with no support and no turning back. Their ships were packed to the seams with refugees, people with no home to go back to. Nobody would be happy to greet them in the state that they were in, except apparently the Terrans. Several weeks went by before our second probe reached the Sol system, purpose-built to study how the human and Velari races interacted. By the time it arrived, it brought back news of what happened. The human governments of Guyana, and yes, there were many of them, had accepted the Velari into their society. Their planet was teeming with construction, and about half of the ships that arrived at their destination were still orbiting space. Most of the space debris, curiously, was cleared out. It would be a while until they were fully adapted, though. Nobody could handle so many refugees at once. except as we found out, the Terrans. As the few researchers tasked with watching the drone footage saw, the residents of Guyana adapted extraordinarily quickly to their new situation. They built new structures at blistering speed, utilizing massive machines that simply printed entire cities in just a few weeks. Valari freighters that once shipped cargo now moved in the Helion Divide, mining materials to build new structures and, most surprisingly, new ships. The Terrans had apparently learned to reverse engineer virtually every technology that Valari had to offer, from particle shields to QSX drives. Vehicles that once were wheeled or tracked were converted to hold anti-gravity nodes. New unique ships supposedly of human design were built, and to our shock they proved even faster than the Valari ships to surpass them. Never had we seen such industriousness before. On most planets it took months to build a new ship, and another month if it was to have an QSX drive, which were somewhat rare throughout the Coalition. Most Coalition ships relied on sunlight engines, as QSX drives were too complicated to mass produce and too expensive to make standard issue. Only wealthy inter-system traders or large military command barges or warborns had them, while most other smaller ships like strikers and vanguards didn't have them at all. And on this previously ignored planet, new ships would be built and launched in a week. While some would hover around Guyana or the local moon, most would immediately make use of their QSX drives and punch a hole in time-space, traveling to who knows where. By now, our leaders were growing both curious and anxious at this new threat to their way of life. Draxan generals were vocal about seizing whatever made the Terrans so efficient, and our Senate capitulated and allowed the Draxan to assemble a strike force to take back what they believed was rightfully theirs. 100 massive ships, including command barges, destroyers, warborns, vanguards, and even a planet-killing planet crusher, all packed with enough firepower to simply subjugate another member race if they wanted. Thousands of small fighters, hundreds of troop transports and landing craft for the eventual takeover of planet Guyana. A single planet against the might of a full Draxan fleet was a pushover, no matter how prepared you were. And there was no way Guyana was prepared after only a rotation since the Valari first appeared at their doorstep. Most races would surrender immediately and hope to get away with their lives, as the Valari did after just 2 days of fighting. Except, of course, the Terrans. As soon as the Draxan fleet arrived near the system's largest Zephyros core to regroup and begin their attack, a small fleet of 12 Striker-class ships assembled near Guyana to defend their home. As the Draxan approached the Helion Divide, the fleet grew steadily until it matched the Draxan in size, as more ships jumped in from seemingly nowhere. And when the Draxan crossed the belt, the human fleet sped to meet them in the middle on a small red planet called Tharsis. When both forces collided, the battle was more even than anyone thought it could be. Although the Valari ships originally had poor shields and weaponry, just a rotation prior, the human strikers and warborns seemed to match their Draxan counterparts, trading blow for devastating blow. The Draxan fleet was whittled down to 50 ships, including their flagship Dreadnought, and a few command barges meant for subjugating a planet battling against 60 human strikers and destroyers, all intent on driving back the enemy. Eventually the Draxan decided to retreat. The Dreadnought turned away from Guyana, attempting to jump back to friendly territory before it was destroyed. Before it and the remaining ships could, though the 3 largest human command barges released a small wave of fast troop transports, numbering nearly 500 each, directed at a specific Draxan ship. While the fleet was attempting to flee, they failed to see the transports punch into their ships' hulls and lock in before jumping away into a nearby allied system. human shock troopers in tow. The scouting probe watched as the human ships hovered near Tharsis, as if waiting for the Draxan ships to return and renew their attack. But the Draxan ships were gone for good. They had retreated. Never once had a Draxan full fleet been so battered that they were forced to fall back. No race's military was capable of standing up to them in a battle and going toe to toe, except evidently the Terrans. The Draxan leaders were shocked at the defeat, an entire full fleet and 4 million servicemen reduced to quarter strength by the effort of a single planet, and what were a bunch of fumbling apes just 500 hours ago. There was outrage at this turn of events, and the Draxan generals called for the Flag Admiral to be reprimanded, executed, and perhaps even demoted to midshipman afterwards. However, communications with the flagship Planet Crusher were never answered, and the ship was presumed destroyed. This was even worse, one of their prize flagships destroyed. Those ships were the top of the line, and there were only 9 of them in the entire coalition. It was unfathomable. The Draxan prepared to mobilize their entire military, since the rest of the coalition didn't want to step in for a number of reasons. Therefore, remaining full fleets combined together and prepared to rendezvous with the survivors of their expeditionary force. On arrival, the fleet admirals were in for a pleasant surprise. Their prized Planet Crusher was not in fact destroyed. It hovered in place, surrounded by its supporting command barges and warborns, all 4 massive planet-killing cannons charged and ready. This too came as a surprise to the fleet admirals. It was standard protocol to never keep Planet Crusher cannons charged unless you were ready to fire. Otherwise, your ship's power would be drained, your shields would falter, and your cooling systems would eventually fail to do their job. It was too late that the 4 Draxan admirals realized what had happened. By the time the call went out to engage evasive maneuvers to divert all power to shields, to charge their own cannons, or to abandon ship entirely, as all 4 flagships had in the chaos forgotten to communicate with one another. The Planet Crusher, facing them, had fired its cannons with perfect accuracy. Each huge blast of energy with the power of 1,000 nuclear warheads behind it hit its target head-on. The force of the explosion wasn't enough to completely destroy the Planet Crushers, but it eliminated their shields, knocked out their main and backup reactors, and obliterated most of their support ships in the direct vicinity. As the 4 flagships went dark, all systems offline, the admirals watched through the windows of their bridges as the 60 human ships their colleague had faced in battle jumped in, turned towards the Planet Crushers, and launched waves of void blades. 12 pulses hence, the Draxan signed a treaty of unconditional surrender to the newly formed Dominion of Sol. It surrendered all of their slaves, surrendered their technology, and stated that they no longer owned the 5 Planet Crushers that the joint human Danyek military now occupied, hovering ominously over the Draxan homeworld's capital. Never had anyone stood up to the most powerful force in the galaxy and turned its own weapons against it. Not once had the Draxan suffered a defeat, so crushing a defeat that would never again allow them to be as mighty as they once were. It seemed that nothing would ever be as powerful as they once were, except, well, the Terrans.